The desert night stretched infinite above me, cold and indifferent as the void itself. For 40 years I had studied the heavens, charting the slow dance of celestial bodies across the endless dark. The stars whispered secrets to those patient enough to listen, but their language was one of silence and shadow. My hands, wrinkled and stained with ink, traced patterns on parchment that few men alive could understand. I was Melchior, keeper of ancient knowledge, guardian of forgotten wisdom. In the great library of Babylon, surrounded by tablets older than memory, I had dedicated my life to a single obsession. The prophecies spoke of a king whose birth would shake the foundations of the world, not through conquest or bloodshed, but through something far more dangerous: truth. My colleagues dismissed me as mad, wasting my years on myths and legends, but I had seen things in the heavens they could not comprehend, alignments that defied natural order. The night it appeared, I was alone in my observatory tower. The air hung thick with incense and the weight of anticipation. My calculations had predicted something, though I dared not speak its name aloud. Then, like a wound torn in the fabric of night itself, the star blazed into existence. It did not twinkle like its brothers, but burned with steady, terrible purpose. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was witnessing. This was no ordinary celestial phenomenon. It moved with intention, defying every law I had learned. The ancient texts had warned of this moment, but nothing could have prepared me for the raw power emanating from that distant light. I felt it in my bones, in my blood, in the deepest chambers of my heart. A king had been born, and the heavens themselves were announcing his arrival. I knew in that moment my life had changed forever. The comfortable existence of scholarship and solitude was ending. The star was a summons I could not ignore, a call that transcended reason and safety. I would have to leave everything I knew, journey into foreign lands, and seek this newborn king. The thought filled me with equal parts terror and exhilaration, for I understood that this journey would either confirm everything I believed or destroy me utterly.
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
The message arrived 3 days after the star's appearance, carried by a rider whose robes were caked with desert dust. Gaspar and Balthazar had seen it too, each from their own distant observatories. The parchment trembled in my hands as I read their words, finding my own shock and wonder reflected in their hurried script. We had known each other for decades, rivals and companions in the pursuit of celestial knowledge. Now the stars had united us in purpose. Gaspar wrote from Persia, his words dripping with barely contained excitement. He described the star's impossible brightness, how it had appeared suddenly in the western sky, moving against the fixed patterns we had studied all our lives. His calculations matched mine perfectly, down to the hour and minute of its manifestation. He proposed we meet in Damascus, pool our knowledge, and journey together to discover what lay beneath that burning light. Balthazar's letter was more cautious, weighted with the gravity of a man who understood the danger we faced. From his tower in Arabia, he had consulted texts even older than those in my possession. The prophecies of the Hebrews spoke of such a sign, he wrote, a star that would herald the birth of their long-awaited Messiah. But prophecies were dangerous things, especially when they concerned kings and kingdoms. Herod, who ruled Judea at Rome's pleasure, was not known for tolerance. I spent that night in the observatory, watching the star hold its position above the western horizon. It neither rose nor set with the others, but hung suspended as if waiting. Around me, the familiar tools of my trade seemed suddenly inadequate. Astrolabes and charts could measure but not explain. This was something beyond natural philosophy, beyond human understanding. It spoke to something deeper, more primal. The decision crystallized as dawn broke over the Euphrates, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. I would go. Whatever awaited us in the west, whether glory or destruction, I could not turn away. My servants watched in confusion as I ordered preparations for a journey of unknown length to an uncertain destination. They thought me mad, perhaps, but madness and wisdom often wore the same face. The star burned in my mind's eye, and I knew I would find no peace until I stood before the one it proclaimed. Damascus rose from the desert like a fever dream of limestone and shadow. Its ancient walls had witnessed empires rise and fall, had drunk the blood of countless wars. I arrived at sunset, when the city transformed into a labyrinth of torchlight and whispered transactions. The inn where we had agreed to meet stood in the merchant quarter, its courtyard filled with camels and the sharp scent of spices from distant lands. Gaspar arrived first, his Persian robes marking him as foreign, exotic, possibly dangerous. Age had bent his spine but sharpened his mind, and his eyes still burned with the fierce intelligence I remembered from our younger days. We embraced like brothers returning from war, which, in a sense, we were. For years, we had battled ignorance and superstition, clinging to reason in a world that preferred comfortable lies. Now that same reason had led us to abandon everything for a star. Balthazar appeared at midnight, emerging from the darkness like a ghost made flesh. His skin was darker than ours, his features carved from some harder stone. He carried himself with the dignity of desert kings, though he claimed no title save that of scholar. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. He had brought texts with him, carefully wrapped scrolls that contained the words of Hebrew prophets long dead. We spent 3 days in that courtyard, comparing observations and arguments with the intensity of men possessed. The star hung above us each night, unwavering, patient. Gaspar had calculated its position would lead us to Judea, to the lands controlled by Rome and ruled by Herod. Balthazar translated the ancient prophecies, his finger tracing words that spoke of Bethlehem, of a king born in poverty, of nations brought to their knees. I listened and felt certainty crystallize into something harder, more terrible. We were not simply following a star, we were walking into destiny itself. The prophecies spoke of light, yes, but also of blood and suffering. Kings did not surrender their thrones willingly, and Herod's reputation for cruelty was legendary. Yet the star called us forward, and we could no more resist than moths could flee from flame. We would leave at dawn, 3 old men seeking a child we had never met, betting everything on the testimony of light and ancient words. The desert stretched before us like an ocean frozen in stone and sand. Our caravan moved slowly, camels laden with supplies and gifts deemed worthy of a king. Gold from my treasury, frankincense from Gaspar's stores, myrrh from Balthazar's collection, each substance precious, each carrying layers of meaning. Gold for royalty, frankincense for divinity, myrrh for mortality. The symbolism was not lost on us, though we did not yet understand its full weight. We traveled by night, following the star that never wavered from its position. During the day, we sheltered from the sun's merciless eye, huddled in tents that provided little relief from the heat. The journey stripped away the comfortable veneer of civilization, reducing us to our essential selves. Conversation became sparse, then silent. Each man wrestled with his own doubts and fears, alone despite our proximity. Bandits tracked us for 3 days, shadows moving along the ridgelines. They saw wealthy men traveling through lawless territory and imagined easy prey. What they couldn't see was the hardness that had grown in us, the sense of purpose that made death preferable to turning back. When they finally attacked, sweeping down from the hills with curved blades gleaming, we met them not with fear, but with defiance. Our guards fought with the desperation of men protecting something sacred. The battle was brief and brutal. Blood darkened the sand, boom, and bodies lay twisted under the indifferent stars. We lost 2 men, good men who would never see their families again. I knelt beside them as life faded from their eyes, and wondered what kind of king was worth this price. Gaspar cleaned his blade in silence, his face carved from stone. Balthazar spoke prayers in a language I didn't understand, his voice breaking with emotion. We buried our dead and moved on, because the star gave us no choice. It burned above us with steady intensity, neither forgiving nor condemning. The desert consumed the graves within hours, sand erasing all evidence of violence. I understood then that we had crossed a threshold. We were no longer scholars on an academic pursuit, but pilgrims on a journey that demanded everything. The star led us forward, and we followed, changed by blood and sand into something harder, more dangerous, more desperate for meaning in a world that offered only death and silence. 3 weeks into the desert, Balthazar grew ill. Fever seized him in the night, twisting his body with convulsions that left him weak and trembling. We made camp early, erecting his tent with frantic hands while the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. Gaspar and I took turns applying cool cloths to his burning skin, watching helplessly as he muttered in delirium. The star watched from above, offering light but no comfort. In his fever dreams, Balthazar spoke prophecies of his own, words that chilled me despite the desert heat. He described a child born in darkness, a king crowned with thorns, a sacrifice that would echo through eternity. His hands clutched at empty air as if grasping for something just beyond reach. I didn't know if these were true visions or merely the ravings of a sick mind, but they burrowed into my consciousness like parasites. Gaspar confessed his doubts that night as we sat vigil over our companion. "What if we were wrong?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. What if the star was merely a natural phenomenon we had misinterpreted through the lens of our own desperation for meaning? What if we arrived to find nothing but an ordinary child? Or worse, no child at all? The questions hung between us, unanswered and unanswerable. I had no comfort to offer because I shared his fears. 40 years of study had taught me that the universe operated according to laws, patterns that could be measured and predicted. Yet here we were, three supposedly rational men following a star that defied all natural law, seeking a king prophesied by texts written centuries before we were born. Madness and faith looked remarkably similar from certain angles, and I could no longer distinguish between them. Balthazar survived the fever, though it left him gaunt and hollow-eyed. On the morning he finally rose from his sickbed, he gathered us close and spoke with terrible clarity. The prophecies, he said, spoke not just of a king's birth, but of his death. This child we sought would be both savior and victim, would bring both peace and sword. The star was leading us not to a coronation, but to a mystery deeper and darker than we could comprehend. We should turn back, he urged, before we became complicit in something we didn't understand. But even as he spoke, I saw in his eyes that he knew we wouldn't. The star had us now, and it would not let us go. The border between wilderness and civilization appeared suddenly, marked by Roman watchtowers that rose from the earth like broken teeth. We approached cautiously, aware that we were entering Herod's domain, a kingdom held together by fear and Roman steel. The soldiers who stopped us were professionals, their eyes scanning our caravan with practiced suspicion. They saw wealthy foreigners, potential threats or profitable bribes, and their hands rested casually on sword hilts. Gaspar spoke to them in crude Latin, explaining we were scholars and merchants traveling to Jerusalem on peaceful business. The lie came easily to his lips, smooth as oil. We had agreed to reveal nothing of our true purpose until we understood the political landscape. Herod's paranoia was legendary, his throne maintained through a network of spies and informants. To mention a newborn king would be to invite disaster upon ourselves, and worse, upon the child we sought. They searched our belongings with rough efficiency, confiscating nothing but making clear their authority. One soldier, younger than the others, stared at the star with troubled eyes. He asked if we had seen it, that strange light that hung above the western horizon. His captain struck him silent, but I saw fear flicker across hardened face. Even Rome's legions, masters of the known world, could not ignore the testimony of the heavens. We were allowed to pass, but I felt their eyes following us long after we left the checkpoint behind. The landscape changed as we moved deeper into Judea, becoming more cultivated, more controlled. Olive groves stretched across hillsides, vineyards heavy with fruit. This was land that had known countless masters, had been fought over and bled for since before history was written. The stones themselves seemed to remember violence. Villages appeared more frequently, clusters of white limestone houses where people lived lives of quiet desperation under foreign occupation. We saw Roman soldiers everywhere, maintaining order through visible force. The Jews we encountered regarded us with wary curiosity, trying to determine if we were allies or threats. I wondered what they would think if they knew we sought their prophesied Messiah, if they would welcome us or drive us away. The star burned above, indifferent to politics and power, leading us deeper into a web of intrigue we barely understood. Jerusalem rose before us like a vision from ancient texts, its walls catching the setting sun until they seemed forged from bronze and gold. The temple dominated the skyline, Herod's obsessive renovation project gleaming with fresh stone and precious metals. It was meant to inspire awe, and it succeeded, but I felt something else beneath the grandeur, a hollowness, as if all that beauty concealed an emptiness at the city's heart. We entered through the Damascus Gate, joining the flow of pilgrims and merchants that kept the city alive. The streets pulsed with barely controlled chaos, 1,000 languages and accents colliding in the narrow passages between buildings. The smell of spices and incense mixed with human sweat and animal waste, creating an assault on the senses that left me disoriented. This was the center of the Jewish world, yet Rome's eagles perched on every major building, a constant reminder of who truly ruled. Gaspar insisted we seek audience with Herod immediately. The star had led us to Judea, but its precise meaning remained unclear. Where exactly was this king born? In which village or town? We needed information, and who better to ask than the current king himself? Balthazar and I argued against this course, sensing danger, but Gaspar's logic was sound. We were foreign dignitaries, scholars of repute. To avoid the king would raise suspicions worse than a direct approach. The palace guards regarded us with contempt barely concealed behind professional courtesy. They made us wait in an antechamber for hours, a calculated insult designed to establish hierarchy. I studied the walls, decorated with imagery that tried too hard to blend Jewish tradition with Roman grandeur. Herod was a man caught between worlds, accepted fully by neither, ruling through fear because love was forever beyond his reach. When we were finally admitted, I felt the temperature drop despite the braziers burning throughout the throne room. Herod sat elevated above us, an old man whose eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator. He wore wealth like armor, gold and purple announcing his status, but I could see the paranoia eating at him from within. This was a king who had murdered family members to protect his throne, who saw threats in every shadow, and we had just walked into his court asking about a newborn king. I realized then that Gaspar had made a terrible mistake. Herod's voice carried the rough edges of his Idumean origins, never quite refined by decades of power. He leaned forward on his throne, fingers gripping the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. "Tell me again," he commanded, "about this star you follow." His words were honey laced with poison, superficially welcoming while his eyes calculated our worth and threat. Behind him, advisors and priests shifted nervously, understanding something was happening that went beyond protocol. Gaspar explained our observations with the precision of a scholar, describing the star's impossible movements and unusual brightness. He spoke of ancient prophecies that predicted such a sign would herald the birth of a great king of the Jews. I watched Herod's face carefully, seeing how each word landed like a physical blow. The king's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple. His hands trembled slightly before he forced them still. The king summoned his chief priests and scribes, demanding they reveal where the Christ was to be born. They consulted scrolls with reluctant hands, their voices barely audible as they quoted the prophet Micah. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they said, "for so it is written." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. I saw something dark pass behind Herod's eyes, a decision being made that would ripple through history in ways we couldn't yet comprehend. Herod dismissed his advisors and invited us to speak privately in an inner chamber. The gesture was presented as an honor, but felt more like a trap closing. He offered us wine from golden cups, playing the generous host while his mind worked through the implications and consequences. He spoke of his devotion to the Jewish people, his desire to worship this newborn king alongside us. The lies dripped from his tongue with practiced ease. He asked when exactly the star had appeared, and I answered truthfully, not yet understanding why this mattered to him. He urged us to go to Bethlehem, to search diligently for the child, and when we found him, to return and report his exact location, so that I too may go and worship him, Herod said with a smile that never reached his eyes. We agreed, bowed, and left, but I felt his gaze following us like a curse. Balthazar whispered urgently as we exited the palace. We had just made a deal with a devil, and a child's life now hung in the balance. We left Jerusalem at dawn, claiming business matters required our immediate attention. In truth, we were fleeing, though from what exactly remained unclear. The city felt suffocating, its walls pressing in with the weight of accumulated violence and broken promises. Herod's false smile haunted my thoughts, and I understood with growing certainty that we had been fools to approach him. We had handed him knowledge he would twist into a weapon. The road to Bethlehem wound south through rocky hills dotted with olive trees twisted by age and wind. Gaspar rode in brooding silence, finally recognizing the magnitude of his error. Balthazar consulted his scrolls compulsively, searching for guidance in words written by dead prophets. I watched the star, which had seemed to intensify since our arrival in Judea, burning with an urgency that matched the quickening of my pulse. We passed other travelers, families making the journey for reasons of their own. I saw poverty in their faces, the weariness of people ground down by taxation and occupation. These were Herod's subjects, the people he claimed to rule for their own good. Yet I saw no love in their eyes when his name was mentioned, only fear and barely suppressed hatred. A kingdom built on such foundations could not stand forever. Bethlehem appeared in late afternoon, smaller than I had imagined for a place of such prophetic significance. David's city, they called it, birthplace of Israel's greatest king. But that glory belonged to the distant past. Now it was a backwater village, unremarkable except for the star that hung directly above it, bright even in daylight. My heart hammered against my ribs as we entered the town, understanding that our journey was approaching its culmination. We made inquiries carefully, seeking a child born recently under unusual circumstances. The villagers were suspicious at first, protective of their own, but gold loosened tongues as it always did. They spoke of a couple who had arrived for the census, a young woman giving birth in a stable because there was no room elsewhere. The child had been visited by shepherds claiming angels had announced his birth. The story sounded like madness, but the star blazed above us, confirming what reason denied. We had found him. The house stood at the edge of Bethlehem, modest even by the village's humble standards. It belonged to a family who had taken in the young couple, offering shelter more permanent than a stable but hardly palatial. We approached on foot, having left our camels and servants behind. This moment felt too sacred for procession and ceremony. The star hung directly overhead now, so bright it cast shadows even as the sun set behind the hills. My hands trembled as I lifted them to knock, and I paused, suddenly paralyzed by doubt. What if we were wrong? What if this was merely a child born to poor parents, unremarkable except for our desperate need to find meaning? 40 years of study, months of dangerous travel, lives lost in the desert, all of it resting on the testimony of light and ancient words. Gaspar placed his hand on my shoulder, his touch steadying me. We had come too far to hesitate now. The door opened, revealing a young man with carpenter's hands and wary eyes. Joseph, I would later learn his name was Joseph. He studied us with the caution of a man who had learned to expect trouble, saw our foreign clothes and expensive gifts, and seemed ready to turn us away. But something in our faces must have communicated our sincerity, or perhaps our desperation. He stepped aside, allowing us entry into a single room lit by oil lamps and a small cooking fire. The air inside was thick with the smell of simple food and human habitation. A young woman sat in the corner, and even in the dim light, I could see she was barely more than a girl. Mary, her name was Mary, and she held an infant in her arms with the fierce protectiveness of a lioness. She looked up at us with eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. Fear, yes, but also a strange peace, as if she knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. I tried to speak, to explain who we were and why we had come, but words failed me. How could I tell them we had traveled across the known world following a star? That we believed this child, wrapped in common cloth and cradled in his mother's arms, was the fulfillment of prophecies older than empires? That we had promised Herod we would reveal his location? The weight of what we had done crashed over me like a wave, and I fell to my knees, not in planned worship, but in genuine collapse. Gaspar and Balthazar knelt beside me, and we three old men wept before a child who could not yet speak. The child's eyes opened, and I felt something shift in the fabric of reality itself. They were dark, deep, impossibly aware for an infant of perhaps 2 months. He looked at each of us in turn, and I had the uncanny sensation of being truly seen for the first time in my life. Not just my physical form, but everything beneath. My fears, my doubts, my sins, the small cruelties and large failures that had marked my passage through the years. I should have felt exposed, vulnerable, but instead I felt known, and somehow forgiven. Mary spoke softly, asking who we were and what we wanted. Balthazar found his voice first, explaining in halting Aramaic that we were scholars from the East who had followed a star to find the newborn king of the Jews. Her face paled at those words, and Joseph moved protectively closer. They understood better than we did the danger such a title carried in Herod's domain. But she did not deny it, did not laugh at our presumption. Instead, she simply nodded, as if she had been expecting us. We presented our gifts with trembling hands. Gold, the metal of kings, acknowledging his royal lineage. Frankincense, the incense of priests, recognizing his divine nature. Myrrh, the spice of burial, though I didn't yet understand why that particular gift seemed necessary. The child reached out with tiny fingers, touching the containers, and I felt foolish offering such things to one who seemed to need nothing we possessed. Gaspar asked permission to hold him, and Mary, after a moment's hesitation, placed the child in his aged arms. I watched my companion's face transform, decades of cynicism and scholarly detachment melting away like ice under summer sun. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he looked into the child's face. "This is him," Gaspar whispered, all doubt finally erased. "This is the one the prophets foretold." The star had not lied. When my turn came, I held the child with infinite care, terrified my trembling would drop him. He was warm and solid, undeniably real, yet holding him felt like embracing a paradox. This was flesh and blood, vulnerable and dependent, yet I sensed power coiled within that tiny form, power that made the star itself seem dim. The child made a small sound, something between a coo and a sigh, and I understood in that moment that I held the answer to every question I had ever asked, not in words or formulas, but in the simple reality of incarnate mystery. I was holding God, and God was holding me. We stayed through the night, unable to leave, drawn by a gravity that had nothing to do with obligation. Mary told us her story in quiet tones while Joseph kept watch at the window. She spoke of an angel's visit, of impossible promises, of a pregnancy that defied nature. She described the journey from Nazareth while heavy with child, the desperate search for shelter, giving birth among animals while the world ignored its own salvation. She spoke without self-pity, stating facts as if describing events that had happened to someone else. Joseph added his own testimony, the dreams, the angels, the agonizing choice to stand by her despite the scandal. He was a man of few words, but I heard steel beneath his quiet voice. He would protect this child with his last breath, would face down armies if necessary. Looking at this humble carpenter, I realized he possessed a courage that put my own scholarly pursuits to shame. He had risked everything for faith, while I had only risked comfort. As midnight approached, exhaustion finally claimed me. I drifted into sleep sitting against the wall, the child's face still glowing in my mind's eye. Then the dream came, vivid and terrible. An angel stood before me, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, its form burning with light that should have blinded me. It spoke with a voice like thunder filtered through honey, each word resonating in my bones. "Do not return to Herod," the angel commanded. "He seeks the child to destroy him. Return to your country by another route." The vision shifted, and I saw Jerusalem burning, heard the screams of mothers whose children were torn from their arms. I saw Herod's soldiers moving through Bethlehem with drawn swords, seeking a child they would never find because God had already moved him to safety. I saw my own guilt, understanding that our foolish audience with the tyrant had set these horrors in motion. I woke gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. Across the room, Gaspar and Balthazar were also stirring, their faces pale in the lamplight. We had all received the same dream, the same warning, the same terrible knowledge. We had to leave immediately, had to flee before Herod grew suspicious of our delay. But more than that, we had to ensure Joseph and Mary understood the danger. Our mistake had painted a target on this child's back, and we would spend the rest of our lives wondering if we had done enough to protect him. Dawn broke cold and gray, the star finally fading as natural light reclaimed the sky. We gathered our things in frantic silence, aware that every moment we remained increased the danger. Joseph was already awake, had been awake, I suspected, all night. I told him of the dream, of the angel's warning about Herod. His face hardened into something like stone, but his hands were gentle as he touched his sleeping wife's shoulder. Mary woke and understood immediately, mothers possessing instincts that transcend explanation. She gathered the child to her breast, whispering words I couldn't hear, promises or prayers, or both. I wanted to apologize, to beg forgiveness for the threat we had brought to her door. But what good were words against the weight of what we had done? We had sought a king and found him, but in finding him, we had endangered everything. Balthazar pressed most of our remaining gold into Joseph's hands, enough to fund a long journey and extended exile. "Go to Egypt," he urged, his voice breaking. "Herod's reach doesn't extend that far. Stay there until the tyrant dies, until it's safe to return. Joseph accepted the coins without pride or protest, understanding they represented his family's survival. I saw him calculate distances and costs, already planning their escape route. We made our farewells quickly, knowing the sun's rising brought increased risk of observation. I knelt one final time before the child, committing his face to memory. Those eyes looked into mine, and I felt blessing mixed with burden. I had been chosen to witness this moment, but I would also carry the weight of what came next. The mothers of Bethlehem would weep because of what we had set in motion, and that blood would stain my conscience until death. At the door, I looked back one last time. Mary held her child. Joseph stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, and they formed a portrait of courage facing impossible odds. They were fugitives now, refugees fleeing a king's paranoia, but they moved with dignity that made mockery of Herod's golden throne. We turned away and slipped into the pre-dawn shadows, three old men fleeing the consequences of their curiosity. Behind us, the house already felt like a memory, like something glimpsed in a dream, but the child's eyes remained with me, burning in my mind like the star that led us here, refusing to fade even as miles and years accumulated between us. We took a southern route, avoiding Jerusalem entirely, moving through wilderness that swallowed our passage without trace. The star had vanished with the dawn, its purpose fulfilled, leaving us to navigate by more conventional means. We pushed our animals hard, driven by the certainty that Herod's patience would not last long. Every dust cloud on the horizon looked like pursuing soldiers, every stranger a potential informant. Paranoia became our constant companion. 3 days out from Bethlehem, we stopped at a well to water the camels. An old woman drawing water told us news from Jerusalem. Herod had fallen into one of his rages, screaming about foreign sorcerers who had made him a fool. He had dispatched soldiers to question everyone who had seen us, trying to determine where we had gone. The woman's eyes were knowing as she looked at us, understanding we were the source of the king's fury. Gaspar wanted to send word back to Bethlehem to confirm that Joseph and Mary had escaped, but Balthazar argued against it, rightfully pointing out that any message we sent could be intercepted, could lead Herod's hunters straight to the family. We had to trust that the same God who had warned us in dreams would protect them. Trust had never been my strength, built as I was from skepticism and empirical evidence, but I had no choice now except to believe. We crossed into Nabatea, beyond Herod's direct jurisdiction, and finally allowed ourselves to rest. In a caravanserai filled with merchants and travelers, we heard more news filtering down from Judea. Herod had gone mad with frustrated rage, his advisors struggling to contain his paranoia. Some said he was dying, that disease was eating him from within, that his fury stemmed from knowing his time was short. I felt no pity for him, only a cold satisfaction that justice, however delayed, was patient. But then came news that turned my blood to ice. Herod had ordered the death of every male child in Bethlehem under 2 years of age. The massacre had been swift and thorough, soldiers going door to door, ripping infants from their mothers' arms. The streets had run red with innocent blood, and the sounds of mourning echoed from the hills. I collapsed to my knees, unable to breathe, crushed by the weight of what our curiosity had caused. Those children died because we had followed a star, because we had been foolish enough to ask Herod about a newborn king. For 3 days, I could not eat, could not sleep, could only see the faces of mothers whose children had been murdered because of us. Balthazar tried to comfort me with theology, speaking of prophecy and divine plan, but his words were ash in my mouth. What plan required the slaughter of innocents? What God orchestrated such horror? I had spent my life seeking truth, and truth had led me to become an accomplice in genocide. Gaspar bore his guilt differently, retreating into silence so complete he seemed to have forgotten how to speak. He sat for hours staring at nothing, his hands trembling whenever they moved. The proud scholar who had insisted we approach Herod was gone, replaced by a broken old man who understood too late the consequences of hubris. We had thought ourselves wise, had believed our knowledge made us special, had assumed we understood forces we could barely perceive. I walked into the desert one night, unable to bear the presence of my companions or myself. The stars watched from above, cold and distant, offering no comfort. I screamed at them, at God, at the universe that seemed to delight in grinding human hope into dust. Why show us the star if this was the outcome? Why lead us to the child only to stain our souls with the blood of others? The desert absorbed my rage without echo. as indifferent as the heavens themselves. In that darkness, I nearly ended my own life. The knife was in my hand, its edge sharp enough to open veins quickly and cleanly. What right did I have to continue drawing breath when children lay cold in Bethlehem's earth because of my actions? But even as I pressed steel against flesh, I remembered the child's eyes looking into mine. I remembered the sense of being known completely and somehow still accepted. If I died now, I would die believing my life had ended in catastrophic failure, that all my years of study had led only to tragedy. A strange thought came to me then, unbidden and unwelcome. Perhaps the child had survived. Perhaps the angel's warning had come in time. Perhaps Joseph and Mary had fled to safety before Herod's soldiers arrived. I had no evidence for this hope, nothing but desperate need to believe that at least one innocent had been spared. I lowered the knife, disgusted with myself for clinging to such fragile comfort, but unable to let it go. That hope, thin as spider silk, was all that stood between me and absolute despair. Months passed before we finally turned toward home, our journey extended by grief and the need to avoid Herod's reach. We traveled separately for a time, each man needing solitude to wrestle with demons that could not be shared. When we finally reunited at the border of my homeland, we were changed beyond recognition. The scholars who had set out following a star with academic excitement had died somewhere in the desert. We were something else now, something harder and more broken. We never spoke of what we had seen in Bethlehem, not to each other and certainly not to anyone else. How could we explain it? How could we tell people we had found the fulfillment of ancient prophecy, held God incarnate in our arms, and then inadvertently condemned dozens of children to death? The gold and frankincense and myrrh we had presented with such ceremony seemed like bitter jokes now, gifts given to a king we had nearly destroyed through our own stupidity. I returned to my observatory, to my charts and calculations, but the work that had once consumed me now felt hollow. The stars still moved in their ordained patterns, still whispered secrets to those who could read their language. But I had learned that some mysteries were too terrible for human understanding, that knowledge could be a curse as easily as a blessing. I put away my instruments and rarely looked at the sky again. News filtered east over the years that followed. Herod had died shortly after the massacre, his body consumed by disease as his mind had been consumed by paranoia. A fitting end for a tyrant, perhaps, but it brought back none of the children he had murdered. I also heard whispers of a family returning from Egypt to Nazareth, of a child growing up in obscurity. I chose to believe these rumors, chose to hope that the one we had sought still lived, though I had no proof. In my final years, confined to bed by age and illness, I often thought about that night in Bethlehem. I wondered what became of the child, whether he grew to fulfill the prophecies that had driven us across deserts and through darkness. I wondered if he remembered the 3 old men who had knelt before him, if he knew what their curiosity had cost. Most of all, I wondered if the terrible price paid in innocent blood had somehow been necessary, if there was a pattern too vast for my limited understanding to grasp. I died without answers, carrying my guilt to whatever judgment awaited beyond death, but I died also carrying the memory of those eyes looking into mine, and the impossible hope that somehow, despite everything, the light we followed had not been in vain. The scrolls you now read were found among my belongings after death, sealed and hidden where only the most diligent searcher would discover them. I wrote them not as justification or excuse, but as testimony. Future generations should know what happened when 3 men followed a star, should understand that even divine purpose comes wrapped in tragedy and consequence. We sought truth and found it, but truth proved more terrible and beautiful than we could have imagined. If the child we found truly was who the prophecies proclaimed, then he would grow to face his own darkness, his own betrayal, his own death. The myrrh we brought him, the spice of burial, would eventually fulfill its purpose. Perhaps that is the nature of kingship in a broken world, that crowns must be earned through suffering, that salvation requires sacrifice. I do not pretend to understand God's ways, but I know I played my part in a story larger than myself. To those who read this account, learn from our mistakes. Curiosity without wisdom is dangerous. Knowledge without understanding of its consequences can destroy as easily as create. We thought ourselves clever, thought our education and scholarship qualified us to chase divine mysteries. We were fools, and innocents paid for our foolishness. Yet even in our failure, We witnessed something that changed us forever. The star was real. The child was real. Whatever else you doubt, doubt not that. I held him in these aged hands, looked into eyes that held eternity, and felt the presence of something wholly other made wholly present. Whether our journey served his purpose or nearly destroyed it, I cannot say, but I can say with certainty that on one night in Bethlehem, heaven touched earth, and 3 old men were there to witness it. May God have mercy on our souls, and on the souls of those who died because we followed a star into darkness, seeking light.